The phone call had been nothing out of the ordinary on the surface. He had answered it like he did dozens of others each week, jotting down the address, the nature of the problem, and giving an estimated arrival time. Her voice, on the other hand, lingered in his mind even after he hung up. It was pleasant, soft, but carried a strange weight underneath. Not the kind of heaviness that came from a long day, but something quieter, almost as though she was forcing herself to speak in a way that sounded normal. He didn't dwell on it too much. After all, he was a plumber, not a mind reader. Still, the tone stuck with him in the way a single note from a song can echo in your head for hours without reason. The drive over was uneventful, the usual hum of traffic and the low thrum of the radio filling the van. He pulled up to the address, a modest house tucked behind a short hedge, its windows reflecting the pale afternoon light. She opened the door almost immediately after he knocked, as if she'd been standing there waiting. The first thing he noticed was her smile. It was practiced, like a photo pose you've used too many times. Not fake exactly, but stiff around the edges. "Thanks for coming so quickly," she said, stepping aside to let him in. Her tone was cheerful, just enough to pass for sincerity, but her eyes didn't match. They flickered toward the kitchen and then back to him, almost like she wanted to rush the whole thing along. He followed her inside, the faint scent of coffee and something faintly sweet hanging in the air. The curtain was tidy, almost too tidy. The kind of order that sometimes comes when someone needs to control at least one small part of their life. She pointed to the sink, explaining that there had been a slow drip for a couple of days, and that it had gotten worse that morning. Her words were efficient, but her body language told a slightly different story. She kept her arms loosely folded, shifting her weight from one foot to the other, a subtle restlessness that didn't quite fit the simplicity of a leaking pipe. As he crouched down to inspect the cabinet under the sink, he caught her reflection in the chrome of the faucet. She was watching him, but not with the idle interest of a homeowner. Her gaze seemed somewhere else entirely, as if her mind was in a different room, a different moment. When she realized he'd glanced at her, she quickly looked away, busying herself by straightening the already neatly stacked mugs on the counter. There was no obvious tension between them, nothing overtly uncomfortable, but the air carried a quiet hum, like the moment before rain starts to fall. He focused on the task, pulling out his tools and loosening the fittings, yet his awareness of her presence didn't fade. Every small sound she made, the clink of ceramic, the rustle of her sleeve, seemed amplified in the stillness. She knelt beside him at one point to hand him a towel. Her hand lingered for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, as though the simple act of passing an object carried more weight than it should. When he looked up to thank her, he caught a clearer glimpse of her face in the light. The skin under her eyes was faintly swollen, the delicate pinkish hue that remains after tears have dried. It wasn't the kind of detail you noticed if you weren't paying attention, but once you saw it, it was impossible to unsee. He didn't comment. Not yet. There's a line between doing your job and crossing into someone's private world, and he wasn't sure which side of that line he was standing on. She, for her part, kept talking about the leak in measured tones, her words carefully steering away from anything personal, but the way her gaze darted to the floor and her lips pressed together between sentences made it feel like there was a whole other conversation happening just beneath the one they were having. The moment ended with him tightening the last joint and wiping down the edge of the sink. She thanked him again, her smile the same as when he'd arrived, polite, pleasant, but still carrying that faint stiffness. He gathered his tools, aware that he was leaving with more than just the memory of a quick repair. Something about her demeanor had lodged itself in his mind, and as he walked toward the door, the thought formed uninvited. People don't always call for the reason they say they do. Sometimes the leak isn't the real problem. When he stepped outside, the late afternoon sun felt warmer than it had when he arrived, yet he found himself glancing back at the closed door, wondering if he'd just walked away from a stranger's story mid-sentence. The job was done, but it didn't feel finished. He worked in silence for the next several minutes, the muted clink of metal tools and the occasional drip of water from the pipe filling the room. The leak wasn't severe, just a loose joint that had been left unattended for too long. It was routine work, the kind he could do half asleep, but his attention kept drifting back to her. She moved about the kitchen with a quiet efficiency, never far, yet never standing too close. There was something guarded about the way she carried herself, like a person who had learned to keep their distance even in small spaces. When she reached for a towel from the drawer, her hand trembled ever so slightly. It wasn't enough to spill anything or make a scene, but it was there. He caught the movement in his peripheral vision, and filed it away without meaning to. People's bodies often gave them away more than their words did. He kept his head down, letting her have her privacy, but the image stayed with him. A few minutes later she knelt beside him, careful not to crowd his space. She leaned in slightly to see what he was doing, the faint scent of soap and something floral brushing past him. She asked if the leak was bad, her voice calm, yet carrying that same faint tightness as when she'd first spoken to him. He told her it wasn't serious, just needed tightening and a new washer. She nodded, offering a small smile, and handed him the towel she'd fetched earlier. That's when he really saw her. The sunlight filtered through the half-closed blinds, landed across her face. In that angled beam, the details stood out more sharply. The redness along her lower eyelids, the slight puffiness beneath them, the way the skin seemed stretched and tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. They were the kind of eyes you got after crying for too long. The kind where no amount of cold water or concealer could fully hide the evidence. He didn't say anything. It wasn't his place, at least not yet. People had their reasons, and most didn't appreciate strangers poking around in them. But as she shifted away, he found himself wondering what had happened before he arrived. Had the tears been fresh this morning, or were they from last night, long enough ago to leave only the swelling? Had she been alone when it happened, or was there someone else in the house, someone who'd caused them? The thought nagged at him while he worked. She was quiet now, standing a few steps away, absent-mindedly adjusting things on the countertop. She lined up the mugs in a neat row, though they were already straight. She opened and closed a cupboard door without taking anything out. It wasn't nervous energy exactly. More like she needed something to do with her hands. Anything to avoid standing still. Every so often he glanced toward her, catching her gaze flicker away each time. It wasn't Aiton's born of rudeness, but the kind that came from not wanting to be seen too closely. People do that when they're afraid their face will betray them. The sound of his wrench clicking into place seemed to fill the room, each turn bringing him closer to the end of the job. But with each click a subtle tension seemed to grow, not between them exactly, but in the space around them. It was the kind of tension you can't measure or name, only feel. He thought again about how quickly she had opened the door when he arrived, as if she'd been ready. How she had thanked him more than once in that polite, perfectly pitched tone. How her smile, while pleasant, had that paper-thin quality that crumples the moment you stop holding it in place. By the time he tightened the last fitting, the sink had stopped leaking entirely. He ran the water to test it, letting it flow in a steady stream, the sound filling the quiet between them. She stepped closer then, leaning on the counter to watch. Her eyes caught the light again, and there it was, undeniable now. The faint swelling, the raw edges of skin that had felt too many tears. He switched off the water and straightened up. She smiled again, thanking him softly, and for a second he almost asked, almost. But instead he wiped his hands on the towel and began packing up his tools. She turned away, moving toward the window, her back to him, as though that small shift in position could hide what her eyes had already given away. The repair was finished, but the moment wasn't. It hung in the air between them, unspoken, stretching thin but refusing to snap. He knew, the way you know when a storm is building miles away, that the question was coming. He just hadn't decided if he was the one who should ask it. He lingered for a moment after packing away his tools, the weight of the unasked question pressing harder with each passing second. Most jobs ended with a polite handshake, a brief thank you and the exchange of payment. This one didn't feel like it wanted to end that easily. She stood by the counter, fiddling with the corner of a dish towel, her gaze fixed on nothing in particular. Her smile from earlier was gone now, replaced by something quieter, almost as if she'd forgotten she wasn't alone. He told himself not to say anything. It wasn't his business. People hired plumbers to fix leaks, not to poke around in their lives. But as he slung his bag over his shoulder, his eyes drifted to hers one more time. That was when the words slipped out, unplanned, almost under his breath. "You said you're fine." His voice was soft enough that for a second he thought she might not have heard him. But she turned her head, and their eyes met. "Then why are your eyes swollen from crying?" The moment seemed to stretch, as if the air between them had thickened. She didn't move at first. Her fingers stilled on the towel, her shoulders tightening ever so slightly. He could see the question land on her, feel the weight of it in the way her breath caught. The words had crossed a line, but not the kind meant to hurt. More like the kind that stripped away the safe distance they'd both been keeping. Her mouth opened slightly as though she might respond, but no sound came. Her eyes, already glassy in the light, seemed to shimmer just a little more. She blinked, slow and deliberate, like someone steadying themselves. He didn't fill the silence. He just waited. In his line of work he had learned that sometimes you have to give a pipe space before it releases what's been trapped inside. People weren't much different. She finally let out a small breath, almost a sigh, but it wasn't accompanied by words. Instead she looked down, tracing an invisible line along the edge of the countertop with her fingertip. The stillness between them was thick now, not awkward but fragile, as if one wrong move might shatter it. He noticed the way her jaw tightened, the faint twitch in her cheek as though she was wrestling with something she didn't want to let out, but couldn't quite keep in. In that moment he realized the question hadn't just been about swollen eyes. It was about everything they didn't say, about the way she'd been standing in that kitchen, moving through her motions like someone trying to fill the silence with anything but truth. He could see now that her earlier politeness had been a mask, and the mask had cracks. The room felt smaller, warmer, Outside, a breeze rattled the branches against the window, but inside, nothing moved except a faint shift of her weight from one foot to the other. She wasn't looking at him anymore, but he had the distinct sense that she was deciding whether to let him into her story, if only for a moment. He didn't push. He didn't offer reassurances or cliches about how everything would be okay. He just stood there, grounded in the quiet, giving her the space to answer or not. The important thing was that the question had been asked, that someone had noticed. It struck him how rarely people really looked at each other anymore. How easy it was to accept "I'm fine" without peeking beneath it. He hadn't meant to look so closely, but now that he had, he couldn't unsee it. The eyes don't lie, not when they've carried the weight of something heavy. She drew in a deep breath, her shoulders rising and falling. For a fraction of a second he thought she might speak, but instead she swallowed whatever was on her tongue. Her lips curved into the faintest shadow of a smile, not the practiced one from earlier, but a smaller, more vulnerable version, and she nodded almost imperceptibly as if to acknowledge the question without answering it. It wasn't closure, but it was connection. The kind that doesn't need a full story to be understood. In that quiet acknowledgement something passed between them, a recognition that sometimes the simplest question can be the heaviest to answer. For a long heartbeat, the room was utterly still. She stood frozen in place, the towel dangling loosely from her fingers, her eyes locked on a spot on the floor as if looking anywhere else might unravel her. The silence between them was thick but not empty. It carried the weight of something unspoken, something that didn't need a name for him to feel it. Then without warning her lips parted ever so slightly, but no words came. Instead the smallest, most fragile sound broke free, the hitch of a breath that trembled on its way out. It was only then that he saw it, the shimmer at the corner of her eye. One tear, unhurried but unstoppable, slipped down her cheek, leaving a faint glistening trail in its wake. She didn't wipe it away, she didn't apologize, she just let it fall, as if holding it in any longer would take more strength than she had left. That one tear said more than anything she could have tried to explain. He didn't step closer, didn't reach out, didn't try to fix it the way he'd fixed the sink. This was different. This wasn't a leak that could be sealed with a wrench and a washer. It was the kind of break you had to let breathe. So he stayed where he was, giving her space but letting his presence remain solid, steady. She glanced at him for just a moment, and in her eyes, he saw both gratitude and a deep, aching exhaustion. Outside, the sunlight had shifted, spilling a softer glow across the kitchen. Dust motes drifted lazily in the air, catching in the light like tiny sparks. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a dog barked once and then fell quiet again. The world beyond the walls continuing on, unaware of the fragile pause happening inside. She sniffed once, quietly, and set the towel down on the counter. "I should," she began, but the sentence never finished. Her voice cracked on the first word, and she shook her head lightly as if brushing away her own attempt. He gave a small nod, the kind that says, "You don't have to explain," because truthfully, she didn't. He had asked, and in her own way she had already answered. Not with details, but with the kind of truth that lives in the eyes and in the way shoulders sag when someone stops pretending. He gathered his things slowly, not because he needed more time, but because it felt wrong to rush. There was a kind of reverence in the air now, the unspoken understanding that this moment was not just about plumbing. Before heading toward the door, he paused, meeting her gaze one last time. She managed another faint smile, small, imperfect, but real this time, and it lingered for a fraction of a second longer than the others had. He opened the door and stepped outside, the late afternoon air cooler than he remembered. As he walked back to his van, he found himself glancing at the house again, not out of curiosity but out of a quiet hope that maybe whatever had swollen her eyes, she wouldn't have to carry it alone forever. Inside, she remained at the counter for a while after the door closed. The kitchen was silent now, except for the faint tick of the cooling pipes. She placed her hands on the smooth surface and exhaled slowly, the kind of breath you only let out when you realize someone has seen you, really seen you, and chosen to stay in that truth without judgment. The leak was gone, the sink was fixed, but for both of them, something else had been repaired in a way neither could name. Sometimes, it's not the problem you call someone to fix that matters. Sometimes, it's the unexpected way they notice the cracks you didn't even mention. And for the first time that day, she let herself believe she might actually be fine. Not because she said it, but because maybe, just maybe, she would be.